Dobre, tak dobrý deň, prajem, vítajte na našom dnešnom podujatí. Poviem zo pár slov na úvod po slovensky, potom switchnem na angličtinu, vzhľadom na to, že akcia teda bude v anglickom jazyku. Vítajte u nás v Novej Cvernovke a taktiež teda u nás na Inštitúte Mateja Bela. Veľmi sa teším, že ste tu. Naša dnesná hostka na diskusie je Zsuzsa Csergő, výskumníčka z Kanady. Hneď vám poviem po anglicky presne, že kto to je a teda čo tu s nami dnes robí. Ale na úvod iba, že veľmi pekne ďakujem, že ste tu. A keby ste mali akékoľvek problémy s rozumením angličtiny, alebo keď chcete položiť otázku po slovensky na záver, kľudne sa na mňa spoľahnite, dá sa to spraviť, ale teraz teda switchnem na anglický jazyk. So, once again, welcome to today's event. My name is Abel Ravas, and I will be your host today. This event is about minority institutions, mainly from a comparative perspective, and I think we have a fantastic guest today. I know people say fantastic guest, but Zsuzsa is a fantastic guest, and I'm very happy that she could make it. But before I introduce her, let me make just a few remarks about what this event even is. You are at the Mateja Bela Institute, physically at Nová Cvernovka, and this event is part of our effort to foster a better legislation in the topic of national minorities in Slovakia. We have created an initiative called Friends of Minorities Parliamentary Group in 2021, so just about 4 years ago. There we combine experts on minority policy and minority law and rights with MPs, members of parliament, who are willing to work with us on these topics. Some of the experts are here today, others are joining us later because they are still in the traffic. So we work with these MPs to influence legislation in the parliament in a positive way. We try to make them understand how they could improve legislation from the perspective of minorities. As part of this effort, we developed a cooperation and a common platform with the USA-based Association for the Study of Nationalities. I will call them ASN, who are providing support for our work, including through events such as today's. So that is why Zsuzsa is here today, and this event is in cooperation with our sponsor, the US Embassy in Bratislava. So on to today's speaker. Zsuzsa Csergő is the Sir Edward Peacock Professor of Nationalism and Democracy Studies at the Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. She's working with the topic of minorities and especially national minorities. Her other topics include institutions, democracy, and she of course specializes mostly in Central and Eastern Europe. Between 2013 and 2020, she served as the president of the mentioned ASN, and now is the director of the association's online initiative, which is sensibly called Virtual ASN. She also leads the Comparative Minority Institutions database. I know that she is going to talk about that later today. That database launched in March 2023. Zsuzsa has kindly prepared a presentation for us. She's going to be presenting very, very shortly. That will be followed by a short discussion. I have a few questions prepared, but then there is space for you, as I mentioned in Slovak. If you want to do your question in Slovak, absolutely no problem. I will provide some, adequate, hopefully, translation. So that's it. I yield the floor to Zsuzsa Csergő. Zsuzsa, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Abel, for this very generous introduction and for inviting me. And I am happy to be part of this ASN and Bell Institute collaboration, which we started a few years ago. And so I'm here wearing two hats, I guess. One is representing, in a way, ASN. I'm part of the core group of the Association for the Study of Nationalism or Nationalities. I keep saying nationalism because nationalities, it's a legacy name for it. But anyway, ASN, and currently director of Virtual ASN. And I'm here as a scholar, as a researcher who has been studying state-minority relations for quite a while, for decades. And in the last 7 or 8 years or so, I have been focusing on the minority institutional spheres within the context of questions about what makes democracy sustainable in states that have minority populations that culturally do not belong to the core nation of the state. And so initially I started focusing, because of my language competence, focusing on Hungarian minorities. I wrote my first book on the language debates in Romania and Slovakia in the 1990s, early 2000s. And then I decided to broaden the scope, partly because I live on the other side of an ocean, and it's much harder to do actual field research when you are there. So I still continue doing field work when I get to come to Central Europe, but I decided to take on, to broaden the comparative perspective and work on, looking for patterns. I have spent quite a bit of time studying Russian-speaking and Polish minorities in the Baltic states. And 2 years ago, actually 4 years ago now, 4 years ago now, we started a comparative project that includes 9 minorities in 8 countries in the region, from the Baltics down to, geographically down to North Macedonia, working with local scholars. Of course, the pandemic intervened. And so I'm very proud of the work that we have been able to do to collect original data on minority institutional spheres. And based on that, we created a database, the core material for which is on these Central and East European minorities. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And I hope that you will have questions that will help me figure out how to continue and improve this work. And so let me see if I can go back. No. It's here, right? Click on this.
It's open here. If you go here, then the taskbar
that's
opens.
right. It does, and then I just go to, and it disappeared. Turn.
No, it's there.
Okay.
All right.
So I titled this presentation Why we need comparative research on minority institutional spheres. And I'm guessing that I won't have to belabor this in this for this particular audience. I don't have to convince you, but I will still tell you where this question comes from, the bundle of issues that we are facing, from which this question comes. So for those of us who are interested in democracy, sustainable democracy in a world where there is exclusionary nationalism, societies are becoming politically increasingly polarized, and threat perceptions are heightening across the board in these countries, also in North America, in the US, and especially not so much Canada at this point, but threat perceptions due to wars, migration, caused by wars and climate change crisis and other disasters. So all of this erodes social resilience. And so the main, I guess, value that my colleagues and I are looking for is social resilience. At a time like this, when all of us are observing political polarization, alienation from politics, alienation from institutions, and so we are social scientists, and we are minority-friendly social scientists who also recognize that nation building, majoritarian nation building, is legitimate, because we live in a world of nation states, there has to be some kind of jurisdiction within political borders. And nation building is essentially, to simplify it, I'm a scholar of nationalism, to simplify it is a way to create a comfortable majority that makes governance much easier. So a comfortable majority, of course, the question is, what is the glue? What are the terms of inclusion? And how are those who do not fit the mold of the core of the majority cultural nation, what to do about those situations? It's a big question. And so I'm speaking in very simplistic terms, but just to put you into the framework from where I am coming. And so there is that. There is a world of nation states, none of which are perfect. Every border was drawn at some point after wars, after some conflict, but there they are. And within that, there is a majority building logic that makes government easier. And nation building within that makes sense. Now, we also have this other issue of how governance is done. So I remember in the 1990s, early 2000s, we were all hoping that the world would be going toward democracy, ups and downs, but somehow going up. And now there's a bit of a crisis, especially after war came back to Ukraine. And of course, there had been wars elsewhere, but those of us who were sitting more comfortably in places where there was no war, where there was democratization and everyone felt that there was progress, we felt protected. We thought that was somehow the logic of it, that it would go in the direction of, exclusionary nationalism is going to be tamed, especially within the European Union. And I think a lot has been done, by the way. But there's this situation we are in right now, and there is a majoritarian impulse that almost makes people feel that minorities, now we have to put them on the back burner. And that's where minority-friendly scholars come in and say, no, shorter term, you might think so, but no, not even medium term, not even medium term, especially not long term, if you want to build sustainable democracy. And there is a rich literature, comparative literature in democracy studies, going back to Robert Dahl and these classics of Guillermo O'Donnell and others who have been talking about how important institutions are. Not only the institution of the state, but intermediary institutions, as O'Donnell, for example, calls them. There's a rich literature on how important institutions in the middle, meso-level social institutions are, not only because they provide alternative sources of power in case the state center tries to turn autocratic, but also because institutions are there to provide a time horizon at a small level, an organizational small level. You send your kid to a school, you want to know that the school is going to exist in 5 years. A university, you want to know that your degree is going to be valuable in 10 years because the university is going to exist. You invest time into a theater, culture, whatever. So institutions provide time horizon. I'm again using O'Donnell's term for that. But they also, an important thing institutions do is they channel conflict. So conflict is there always. Conflict is natural. It would be terrible to imagine a world in which there is no dispute. We all thought the same. So of course there's conflict. There's generational, there's ideological, there's all kinds of conflict. But the question, so the big difference between democracies and non-democracies is how conflict is dealt with. And institutions are therefore channeling conflict. and making things more predictable. And so we know this from mainstream comparative literature on what makes democracies consolidated, sustainable, is that it's always a work in progress. It's not like you've arrived, okay, I've reached the point of consolidated democracy, now we can sit back and do nothing. But it's constant work in progress, and it's institutions, usually institutions in the middle, that matter, not only those, but that matter a great deal. And so if this is true for mainstream societies, it's also true for minorities. And in any society that has minority groups, and all societies will continue to have minority groups of various kinds, because there is migration, there's all that going on, and also there are persistent minorities that want to maintain their culture. And so we know very, very little comparatively about what I call, I'm writing a book about this, the minority condition, which is something that is global and local. So it's global in the sense that in the world of nation states, it's about numbers. There are minorities everywhere. And there are, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this talk, there is the logic of nation building that also makes sense. And so there is this sense of titularity among those who grow up, little kids who grow up as part of the core, the mainstream culture, population, that it's like air, this is my country. And so institutions that function in my language, according to my cultural codes, depending on what the glue is, sometimes it's religion, whatever, that I'm entitled to that, this is my country. And so that is normal. And those who are not, that's special. It doesn't mean that you're against it, but that's extraordinary. And so this is something that I think we have to remind ourselves of, is that there's a titular perspective on the state, and there is a non-titular perspective on the state, and that's a different angle. It's a different angle, and it's structural. Not because those persons belonging to the titular perspective are bad people, but it's a logic, and this is what's global about the minority condition. So what is global, if we want to identify the components, and I'm simplifying as we always do, but especially when we are comparing scarcity, uncertainty, built-in securitization. So scarcity is the persistent weakness in numbers. It starts with that. So the minorities are populations that do not own the state, and they have to accept it. And they have to bargain, they have to do things from that angle. There's uncertainty. In most cases, there are no constitutionally entrenched guarantees for minority cultural reproduction for institutions. In some cases, there are. So there are states that do constitutionally entrench institutions, guarantees for cultural autonomy or territorial autonomy, but in many cases, that's not the case. So if that's not the case, then there's uncertainty about whether institutions that are not the titular, but the special, will exist. Because for those who belong to the titular population, there's always fight about something. What kinds of theaters? What kinds of textbooks? But there will be some theaters, there will be some, right? Schools and universities and media and all of that. But for the special group, it's always a continuous bargaining. And so ethnopolitics becomes entrenched in these situations because the minority institutional sphere is essentially up for grabs in political battles. So that's the uncertainty part, and that's a big part of the minority condition. And the third one is built-in securitization. Again, because of the logic of the nation state, because of the need to create a comfortable majority, there's always some built-in securitization about, okay, is this minority becoming too organized? Is it becoming too large? think Russian speakers in Latvia, Russian speakers in Estonia. So what's the good balance where I don't have to feel, as a titular, I don't have to have what's called in the literature ontological insecurity about state sovereignty, about my nationhood, especially for smaller nations, Estonians, Latvians, I mean, Slovaks is larger than the Baltics, but it's not like Germany or, you get the point. And so this is on a spectrum, of course, but it's built in to the minority condition. And it's most visible when it comes to minorities that we can call caught between states, those that have an activist kin state in the neighborhood. Can't think of any, right? So there are examples for those. So that's when built-in securitization becomes even more tangible and consequential. So that's the global thing, the global aspects of the minority condition, and then there are the local, the situational dimensions, and I'm trying to, I've set up this 4-dimensional model for what matters for minorities, what makes them, what determines how capable they are for democratic activities, organization, agency, as opposed to alternatives, which are non-democratic. So numbers, obviously, relative, it matters, the relative number size vis-a-vis the titular, the majority group. Absolute numbers too. The larger the minority, the more likely it is that they can have a cultural, institutional sphere that provides some diversity, where they are not just dancing folk dances in folk costumes in two places, but they can actually develop culture in the minority condition. Media. It's not easy to maintain minority media when there's flashy media better endowed, but if it's a larger, in absolute numbers, they can do that better. And places, numbers and places are tied, of course, because life happens where people live locally. So it matters, the ethnic demography locally where they are. Time turns out to be a big, significant component, especially when I started comparing Russian-speaking minorities to other minorities in the region. I realized that historicity matters from the perspective of what governments are willing to grant. If you have a historic status that your ancestors have been here for many generations, you're less likely to be excluded from, disenfranchised, right? Labeled a new migrant. So there's that, but there's also an institutional tradition. So after 1990, every segment of these populations had to start from fresh to build the middle civil society organizations, because they were not welcome during the state socialist period. But it mattered whether there was something they could build upon. So historic minorities that had institutional tradition were better endowed. Also, get this, it was a surprise to me to see that learning mattered. So those minorities that had been minorities earlier, before 1990, had an easier time because they had learned what it meant to be a minority. And so they knew what their claims were, they knew how to organize democratically. It wasn't coincidental, for example, that in the Baltics, that the Polish minority was the first to form a party, a political party, even before some of the mainstream Lithuanian parties, because they knew exactly the 2 things or 3 things that they were after at the beginning of the 1990s. So learning, being a continuing minority, in a sense, after regime change or after border change, or was also a resource. And then status, I don't think I have to belabor socioeconomic status. is also matters. And so, for example, again, the Lithuanian case, Russian speakers and Poles in Lithuania, Russian speakers are way better socioeconomically than Poles for historical reasons. And you can see how that also matters in the way they have been able to create meso-level institutional spheres and how they are organizing. It took them a much longer time. So all of this is leading me to say that what we need to pay attention to once we understand the global structural components and the local components, dimensions of the minority condition, is all of that from the perspective of what we are looking for is, so there's this persistent minority condition, not my term, adopted it from a Canadian political theorist, Avisa de McGill University, published a really interesting piece in the American Political Science Review in 2021 about it. So how suppose you're a person, imagine yourself as a person in the persistent minority condition, how do you develop democratic agency? And so first, what is democratic agency in general terms? Again, simplifying it, it's essentially the ability to participate in making the rules by which you're expected to live, rather than always being a recipient of rules that others make for you. Now, this, of course, happens at different levels, but in general terms, that's what political agency is. And it has individual components, and it has a collective dimension, recognized in the broad literature on this. I selected a quote here by Margaret Moore, who wrote a really influential book on the political theory of territory, came out from Oxford in 2015. She comes from the political theorist, justice, morality perspective. So she says it is morally important, both important to individuals and morally valuable in an objective sense, that individuals have control over the collective conditions of their lives and control in the relationships that give meaning to their lives, including their relationships with each other and with place. So this is something that's recognized in theory, and it's pretty mainstreamly recognized in Canada, for example. There is a lot of discussion in this context with reference to this moral obligation on indigeneity and indigenous populations, and so that probably also influences my perspective, having lived there for quite a while. So the persistent minority condition then alters that. So agency is more limited. State's not yours. There are no, especially if there are no counter-majoritarian institutions. Abizadeh calls counter-majoritarian institutions those that are constitutionally entrenched institutions of cultural autonomy or territorial autonomy that guarantee institutional time horizon, instead of always being there as a minority actor and say, we are still here, we are still large enough, and don't be afraid of us. We need this really. And it's good for you if you give this to us. Not only out of the goodness of your heart, although that's good too, but so this constant ethnopolitics in a sense. So what Abizadeh talks about are counter-majoritarian institutions that are constitutionally entrenched. Many states have that globally, a lot of them don't. And those that don't put persistent minority populations in an even more vulnerable position when it comes to this effort to create democratic agency and a good life that makes you interested and invested in democratic, institutionalized, channeled ways of association, and instead of going outside of institutions and turning to other modes of expressing discontent. And so especially those that have minorities that have this kin state situation are even more vulnerable to that. So I just want to show you a little bit of what, I'm writing a book about this, but what are the components of, who are the actors who are engaged in creating minority democratic agencies. So obviously minority actors are those who are creating minority democratic agency. They have allies, they absolutely need allies. But minority agency is the minorities agency, and they need allies. But they are constantly balancing in multiple relational fields. I'm borrowing Rogers-Brubaker's concept there. So they are working, and keep in mind, under shortage, smaller number, uncertainty, constant negotiation, and built-in securitization. So in the intra-minority field, working for some kind of coherence, keeping things together, representation, the titular minority field is super important, obviously, because policy is made by the state, in the state center. So they have to constantly negotiate there as well. There's the inter-minority field. In many cases, that's an important one, when there are several larger, more sizable minorities, and Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, these countries where there are Roma populations is one case. Of course, the inter-minority field has not really been explored in research yet. But in Lithuania, it's quite interesting between Russian speakers and Poles, similar size. So that's why I'm including that as a paired case study. And so that can be a very important field. So they have to work there as well. And then there's the cross-border field. All the time looking for reinforcement, support, without hopefully reinforcing or triggering insecurities, titular insecurities. I bet you can think of some examples for that. And so who are these actors? I categorize them in two clusters: the visibly political actors whose job it is to perform this. They are elected, non-elected bureaucrats, very significant. There's an emerging literature on their role. And then there is the cluster of intermediary actors who are doing this in the meso-level institutional field. School directors, theater directors, teachers, media, elite. I'm using elite in a neutral sense, though. And so those two clusters. And then, having said this, so the emphasis is on institutionalizing conflict, institutionalizing associational life. And so within that, the path to political agency through institutions, this is a simplified visual we created. I'm going to show you my collaborators on this. So first you have to have access to institutions. Then once there's access to institutions, people have to participate. Without access, no participation. Without participation, no agency. So it comes from institutional access, participation, and then once you're participating, then you can seek agency and hopefully gain it in various forms. So this is our, that's the framework. How am I doing time-wise?
Very good.
Doing okay? Okay. So together with, let me show them to you now, Tamás Kis from the Romanian Institute for Research on National Minorities, and Olga Talal, postdoctoral research fellow, University of Toronto. So I started working on this a while ago. I saw how impossible it was for me to do all of this on my own. It's not possible. And then I was also thinking, maybe minority sociologists should also be involved, so it shouldn't be everything done by others on this too. So Tamás Kis is an excellent minority sociologist. Olga Talal was our PhD student, now postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Brilliant scholar herself. And so the three of us during COVID started talking about categories, visualization, how to create an actual database. And we created this database, the Minority Institutions Database, which I'm hoping to open, although I think, no, it was open and then I closed it, right? Peter is not here. Okay, so sorry about this. Here it is.
But it's not showing behind you. It's only...
Okay, why not?
No clue.
What should I do?
I have
maybe
no idea.
Okay.
Maybe not.
No, it doesn't show. So you have to believe me.
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay.
It's not going to work, but I
No,
can...
it's okay. I'll just talk about it.
Oh, Peter is here.
Peter, I think I need your help. I tried to show the database.
All right.
And
When you scroll here, you can go to the internet. And
but it wasn't showing up there.
All right. But you need the presentation to be open, right?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to it. I just wanted to show this.
Okay.
But it's okay if I don't. You know what? It's okay if I don't.
Na obrazovku.
Peter, it's fine. It's fine. I'll just...
Aby mi ukázalo obrazovku, nie prezentáciu. Očividne nie.
It's fine. It's fine. No worries.
All right.
So, now I cannot go back to my slide. So,
Hova?
Oda akarok visszamenni.
A slide-hoz, ne? Akkor
Igen, csak...
Csak háromszor van nyitva azért.
Ja, értem.
Aha.
Okay.
Látom, mi a probléma.
Nem, majd most ez jó lesz.
Várjál.
This is the best.
This is the best. Oké, és akkor innen folytatjuk, jó?
Okay. Right, so we created this publicly accessible database about minority institutional forms, activities, and as I said, the core material is from Central and Eastern Europe, and at this point we have managed to analyze and put in data about Hungarians in Romania and Slovakia, Russian speakers in Estonia and Latvia, Russian speakers and Poles in Lithuania, and we have data on Turks in Bulgaria and Albanians in North Macedonia, also Hungarians in Serbia. And so the categories we have there are micro level about relative status, and the meso level is where we are providing original data. Although the way we are working with the micro level data is also novel, because parity in general education, educational attainment, labor market participation, these are standard individual level indicators that come from censuses and European household survey. And PISA, of course, you know that there's this, the PISA, you know about the PISA survey test, standard test. And so we use those to make sure that we are using easily accessible, officially collected data. And so these are available for individual cases, but what we do here is we show them comparatively. We look at patterns, trends, and we link these in the same database where we also have the meso-level institutional data, which is incomplete because it's extremely difficult to collect. And in some cases, our local researchers were the first ones who started collecting this. And in each case, local minority institution leaders and people who found out about it said, oh, this is wonderful, we want to see what comes out of it. But there was no effort before that because who would think of doing this comparatively? And it's actually a large effort. So at the meso-level analysis, we looked at associational density using a very rudimentary rough measurement for the number of institutions per 1,000 people within the minority population, which of course is faulty because not every organization is equal. Some are larger, some are really active, and others are only on the books, and so on and so forth. But some have more weight than others. But at least it gives you some, a broad view comparatively, and about access. How many institutions are there for members of a minority population? And then we also broke down the institutional sphere along institutional domains: politics, education, religion, culture is really broad, of course, and within that we looked at media and other cultural institutions and social institutions. We didn't look at health and others, but still. We looked at structures of self-governance, which is also very important within organizations, specific organizations, which means, I'm going to show you more detail. So whether within an organization, is it minority governed? So a school, does it have a minority school? Does it have a minority director, minority decision makers? A shared institution like a radio station that has a programming in the minority language. How is that governed? Does that stream have a minority person who makes decisions about that? Do they have a say in decisions that affect them? Multi-ethnic that are designed specifically, that's the smaller number in all cases, that are designed specifically to leave behind the external hierarchy and to create no ethnic hierarchy within the institution. That's a very small number in each case. And then the mainstream, where Hungarians or Roma or Poles or minorities are present, who are minority members, but it's not visible in the structure, in the governance structure. Organizational form, that's where the funding comes from. Is it nonprofit? Is it publicly funded? If so, state or local government or for-profit. We also have been trying to look into external funding. That's it's touchy, gets into this securitization business. Don't have good data on that. We have some intuitions, but so that's not presentable in a public database yet. But so I just wanted to show you a few things, micro level. So this is about parity in education. Striking. Average point difference in PISA scores between minority and majority students. So the straight line is the majority average, which we put at 0, because what we calculated was whether how minorities do in the 3 categories of the PISA, math, reading, and science, do vis-a-vis the mainstream in the country. And so Estonia, Latvia, what you see is super interesting, that those Russian speakers, so this was at the time when it was still possible to study in Russian. That's not going to be the case now. But so Russian speakers who studied in Estonian and took the test in Estonian, and Russian speakers who took the test in Russian. So you see the dotted line in the state language, the straight continuous line in the minority language. Latvia is super interesting, right? So Russian speakers who studied in Russian, took this test in Russian, did way better than those who studied in Latvia and Slovakia is quite puzzling, isn't it? Romania, especially the two compared, quite interesting. We can go back to that. We also calculated it by point average. So this is average across those years. Slovakia is the worst.
Yeah.
So Hungarians who took it in Slovak, that's where they're, so reading minus 83, that's by the PISA experts, 2 years behind the mainstream. That's something.
Okay.
Hungarians in Romania, it's very interesting. Those who study and took the test in Hungarian did better than, sometimes way better than the average. So there are all kinds, so there's not one factor ever to explain these things. But, this is what comparative does. Shows you something, and then you can look behind it to see, okay, what explains this? What are the reasons? Because it's fairly consistent in these cases. Again, can go back if you'd like, but also captured this one, educational attainment measured by the ratio of university graduates. And as you can see here, so 1989 is from the Soviet, last Soviet period census. And what it shows is that Russian speakers were above 2 points, but still these Estonians, higher ratio, got university degrees that declined quite a bit. In Latvia, it declined there as well. So it begs the question, is it that the longer a minority is a minority, the more likely that there will be a gap, a socioeconomic gap measured in educational attainment? I don't know the answer, but it does invite a question about that. Romania, Slovakia, consistently below the minority. In Lithuania, it shows, Russian speakers higher, Poles below. Again, many factors, but begs questions, interesting questions. Now, on the associational level, so this is the meso level. I'm going to only show you these few incomplete tables that are based on incomplete data. So in each country, as I said, associational density is the ratio ratio of number organizations per 1,000 members of the minority, and associational density very high, number of organizations in Slovakia. Hungarians in Romania, it's actually close, high density. Very, very low, Russians in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, a little higher among Poles. Structures of self-governance. So here are minority-governed institutions, minority newspaper, which is where the default language is the minority language, and it's run by an editor-in-chief who's the minority member, and so on. Shared is where it's, in most cases, it's the majority governs it, but there is a stream for the minority in that language, or a program or something. Multi-ethnic, I mentioned to you that these are very, very small numbers, to the point where, for example, Hungarians in Slovakia came out to 0%. We don't have good data on majority governed. We put it in the table, but we don't have enough data. We haven't collected data on what happens where it's a mainstream organization that happens to have large numbers of minority people who are just there, but they might speak their language or between them in one-on-one, but it's not recognized. So organizational form, again, in most cases you can see that the institutional sphere is, nonprofits are very, very high. There is also, in some cases, very high level of local government support funding. For-profits usually are in the media sphere. But essentially what this shows us is that from the pie of organizations across various domains in which culture, churches, social organizations take up a large chunk, is run by volunteers, nonprofits. And they may be receiving some grants from the government. They have to work and apply for it. Again, keep in mind, fewer people. So scarcity, uncertainty, all that, extra work, always extra work, needs extra motivation, and it needs that balancing in all those fields. And the organizational, meso-level organizational sphere is mostly run by volunteers, and guess who they are? Mostly women. And so, thank you for listening.
Yeah.
Back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Zsuzsa. Please come join me.